royal romances, I think this really is the one that captivated so many different people. No, we're not talking about Harry and Meghan, of course. Yes, that captivated people in a different way, didn't it? But way back in the 1930s, this particular romance really sparked, well, an absolute media frenzy. Everybody was fascinated by that story. And it's hard to imagine, chums, just how many newspapers and magazines this sold. This, of course, is in pre-internet. Wallis was at the very early stages, and they were sort of limited about what they could say. Of course, in Europe, they could write literally anything, and this was a problematic situation for the then former King, Edward. And what was also fascinating was the fact that when you look at it now, what did they literally live on? What was the money that they were living on? That's what everybody literally was looking at. You see, a bigger question that a lot of people asked was the simple thing was, what exactly afterwards, when they departed the British monarchy, did they live on? We're talking, of course, Edward and Mrs. Simpson. Well, many people may have realised that they did in fact get a huge allowance, equivalent really in today's money to a few million every year. But what did they actually do for that? Well, keep out of the way. Now, as things developed over the years, they had to find new ways to make money. It's as simple as that. And the idea really was, as I told you, they got offered a lot of big deals, including at that point the fact that the former king could have become a director for MGM over here in the United Kingdom. They were planning to open a big office in Tower Street, just round the corner from the Ambassador Theatre. And they figured that they could offer this office to Edward, not realising, of course, that in fact he really couldn't come back to England on a regular basis. But the boss, including Alvin Thalberg and Louis B. Mayer, thought this was a great way of getting some publicity. But as I pointed out, you see, that fell through. And the reason why all of that really fell through was the fact that not only did he not know anything about that, but it was the wrong time. But as the years moved on, Wallis and the former king literally burned through money. They had a very expensive lifestyle. Now at the beginning, remind you of anyone, people invited them to everything. They could go to any glitzy party, premiere. This was an association. They were the darlings, if you like, of the tabloid newspapers. They were there really to put a focus on whatever they attended. But as the years went on, things became less and less. They became less interesting because people had seen them. They weren't really ready to offer an interview, offer a review, a critique of anything. They simply turned up. And a lot of the time, their high expectation of the way that they were going to be treated, particularly as former royals, was also problematic. So what's being revealed is pretty fascinating because in some of the documentation of some of the bigger studios out in Hollywood, like Columbia, RKO, etc., many over the years had, well, dialogue, discourse, whatever you want to call it, with the former king. And the idea really was to get him on board, particularly with their love story. So if you think about this is how it really has connotations of the Oprah Winfrey interview, because if they could get that down, whether that be in a fictional way or a more structured way, documentary style, etc., well, people were up for it and they were ready. Now, what happened was, and this happened at Columbia Pictures with Harry Cohen, they had a meeting. And they had a meeting which, of course, they had to be paid for. And they sort of loosely discussed their love story. You get the picture? But that went nowhere. Well, a few months later, they then also had a meeting with Darryl F. Zanuck at 20th Century Fox. And once again, that really resulted in something of a payment. Well, when you say payment, it was an incredible payment in many respects. Far more than you and I would live on perhaps for the next few years. But studios at that point had a lot of money. Do you understand how this works now? But this is where things took a turn for the worse, because as the studios then realised whether they'd been had or not, and this necessarily was pushed forward actually by the former king, not necessarily Wallis Simpson. She did not really seek the limelight at all. This is the fascinating bit. He seemed to think that this was a way of getting his story out there. Again, remind you of anybody? Now, moving forward, what happened again was when the studios said, well, we can make it without you, well, legal sort of situations developed. Letters back and forth saying it was their unique story, and they told it in complete confidence. And the studio bosses, while they paid a check, failed, of course, to get them to sign an agreement, even just a brief discussion, because this was just informal at the time. Of course, all these bosses thought they were very much hard-hitting, the plotty people that knew exactly how to run a tough Hollywood. But actually, very, astutely, some people might say, they'd literally been played by the former royal, and that had really funded their, lifestyle for many years. As I pointed out, for over the next few years, Wallis was approached by various things, including to design her own clothes, her own makeup, her own perfume range, and she simply turned it down. She wasn't interested. The king, you see, felt if he could build up an arsenal of money where he didn't necessarily require the still, monthly, weekly, whatever you want to call it, money that was sent over from the British monarchy to, some say, keep him quiet, well, that he didn't want it. He wanted to have his own money so that he was free and could do exactly what he wanted. Sadly, due to their high spending, high living, etc., that was never to be achieved. But it's interesting to think, isn't it, that even a former king could literally make mincemeat of those Hollywood moguls, even though Wallis said nothing good will come of it. But as I said at the start of this video, remind you of anybody? Neil Sean in the very heart of